All right, a couple of things before we get started tonight. Finishing out the material that we will next week. You'll have your first test, so we'll cover tonight. Finish up chapters 5 and 6. One thing is, I want to make sure I've got just a few of you, 7 of you, signed up to go to the Bankers Banquet on March 1st. But if any of you can go, want to attend. I've got some extra invitations up here, so come up and see me after class or if we're on break or whatever, and you're more than welcome to go to the banquet, because the more students we have there, the better it looks to the bankers or to the regulators or whoever's there, who will one day be hiring some of you, hopefully. So if you're interested, let me know. What else? Okay, I guess that's it. What we'll do is we'll just go ahead and jump into where we left off in chapter 5 and 6 combined. We'll finish that. We'll talk about your test next week. We can take a look at the study guide real quick if you want to. Remember I said for the test in here, you're going to make out your own formula sheet. So if there is a formula involved, it's allowed. You know, 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, front and or back. If it's not a formula, okay, you can't have notes, you can't have lists, you can't have, anything but formula. So if you have a question about that in terms of what is a formula, what is not a formula, please come by and see me before the test and let me take a look at your formula sheet. Because I will walk around, look at everybody's formula sheet. If there's stuff on there that's not allowed, typically it's way too much stuff. So it's not like I can just say erase that one small area. It's usually like, an entire page of stuff. So I'll just have to take it up and leave you with no formula sheet. And I don't want to have to do that. So if you have a question, bring it by and let me take a look at it. All right. So any other questions? Comments? You just want to calculate some ratios, don't you? Sneak up on you. Calculate some ratios. Okay, let's, I think we left off, if my memory is correct. Okay, I think we left off here last week. Now, what we did last week is we looked at some bank financial statements. We looked at an income statement. We looked at a balance sheet. It's extremely important for you to know for the test, and just in general if you plan on working for a bank, what is considered the assets of a bank? What is considered the liabilities of a bank? What type of income does a bank have? We talked about interest income and non-interest income, and interest expense and non-interest expense. So it's extremely important for you to recognize that, and we'll work through some of those tonight, calculating some ratios. So I think we left off here looking at, we were here and we took a look at this. I'm just going to jump through this and I won't go through all of it again. But the earnings power formula, we talked about return on equity. Depends on 3 different things. So we were here with financial ratios, and a lot of times, and I understand, you're finance people or accounting people, and you understand numbers pretty well. But a lot of times, whenever you introduce financial ratios to somebody, what you see on the screen is kind of what they think. Okay, it's kind of what comes to mind. And I don't know what the hell kind of language this is, but anyway, if somebody showed me this and said, hey, calculate some ratios with that information, well, I'm not going to be able to do much with it, okay? But as we take a look at this and as we work through some of the ratios, and there are several actually, so there is this entire front and back of ratios, which I'm going to let you calculate tonight, and then we'll take a look at it when you finish. But it's extremely important because with banks especially, their financial statements, the ratio analysis, I mean, that's how you tell. Is it a good bank? Is it a bad bank? Is it having problems? Where is it having problems? Is it doing well? Where is it doing well? That type of thing. Now, a couple of slides here that you're going to see, you saw some of this, something similar to this in Finance 330, so I'm going to move through it pretty quickly. But when it comes to ratio analysis, you know, you've got different types. You've got cross-sectional analysis. That's when you're looking at multiple, in this case, banks, at the same point in time. So December 31st, 2016, we might be comparing 10 different banks located in Murray, Kentucky. Time series analysis. This is where you're looking at one bank, but you're following it over a certain time period. So it may be 8 quarters, which would be 2 years, or maybe you may have a UBPR, Uniform Bank Performance Report, that covers the last 5 years of December 31st information. And then you've got what's called panel data or combined analysis. So this is basically looking at multiple firms over multiple time periods. Now, I forgot to mention this, when it comes to cross-sectional analysis, you can compare against your peer averages. And as we'll take a look at a UBPR if we have time tonight. If not, we'll look at it another time. But that compares every bank in the U.S. against its peer group, whatever peer group that might be, and we can take a look at that and see, you know, where does a bank fall into its peer group. Now, these are just some things to be careful of when doing ratio analysis. Again, if you took me for Finance 330, you have seen this already, but I just want to make sure that everybody had a good understanding of this. The first two kind of go together. Number one says ratios that reveal large deviations from the norm merely indicate the possibility of a problem. And number two says you can't rely on a single ratio in terms of telling how financially strong or financially weak a company is. And that's pretty much common sense. Well, you just can't look at, for example, the ROA of a bank and tell this is a fantastic bank. Or look at the Texas ratio of a bank and say, hey, this is a really bad bank. It's in a lot of trouble. We have to look at the entire picture. Number three, common sense. Financial statements should be dated at the same point in time. So you're going to be comparing December 31, 2016 numbers for both the income statement and the balance sheet, and that works. That's fine. But if you've got, for example, a 2015 income statement and a 2016 balance sheet, it's not going to work very well for you. And then number four, this is typically not a problem with banks because most of their financial statements are going to be audited. Financial data should have been developed using the same methods, and inflation can distort your results. When it comes to banks, the first three typically are more important than the last three. Okay, these are more related to non-financial corporations. All right, now, as we're looking at the categories of ratios, these are bank ratios. For example, when we looked at non-financial corporation ratios in Finance 330, we had 5 different types that we looked at. Okay, now these are the 5 different kinds that we're going to look at when it comes to a bank. So we're going to look at profitability ratios. We're also going to look at loan quality ratios. Another name for this is asset quality. Liquidity ratios, capital ratios, and overhead ratios. Now, these are just 5 categories. There are literally dozens of different categories of ratios we could come up with. I mean, you can just go crazy with this and essentially overwhelm yourself with numbers when it comes to ratio analysis. So that's what we're really trying to stay away from, is that information overload. Now, we'll talk about this for just a second because I want you to understand how bank capital works, especially since we've got a section called capital ratios. And this basically tells us, what does capital do? Because you hear the word capital mentioned a lot when it comes to banks. You hear it mentioned a lot more than with non-financial corporations. And the reason is, you can see what capital does. One, it supports the bank's operations. So for example, when a bank just starts up, so let's say you opened a brand new bank, you don't have any profits. You don't have any money from making loans, interest income or non-interest income to pay your employees. So you have to have something to start with. You have to have some seed money. So in this case, that's going to be the capital. So the capital that your investors give you when you start the bank, that's going to have to sustain your bank for the first probably around 18 months. Okay? So if it's a brand new bank, it's what's called a de novo bank. And a de novo bank, typically it's going to take about 18 to 24 months for it to turn a profit, sometimes longer. But you have to have that capital to pay your bills until you start making a profit or covering your expenses at least. Also, capital acts as a cushion to absorb unanticipated losses. So it could be loan losses, it could be investment losses, whatever type of losses. It is a cushion there to absorb those losses. And to provide protection for uninsured depositors and debt holders in the event of liquidation. So if somebody's got more than $250,000 in a bank and the bank fails, the capital could be used to help pay off that depositor. Okay? Problem is, it's probably not going to be there. So if you have more than $250,000, there is a possibility that you're going to lose some of your money. Now, banks can have Tier 1 and Tier 2 capital. And as I said earlier, these are closely monitored by regulators. I mean, they want to know how much capital does a bank have. So as we're looking at this, a term that you see and hear a lot when you're talking about capital is what's called risk-weighted assets and risk-based capital. And so again, this is not going to be just a huge part or a portion of your test, so I'm going to go through it pretty quickly, but I at least want you to understand what it's talking about. Now, as it says here, the first bullet point here, the capital ratio can be calculated based on total assets, average assets, or risk-weighted assets. And risk-weighted assets take into account the riskiness of the bank's assets and how much capital it actually has to have on hand to mitigate losses. Some assets held by the bank are simply riskier than others. For example, a government bond versus a commercial loan. The government bond is a much, much safer asset for the bank than would be a loan to a business. And as you start studying the banking industry, you're going to see something called the Basel Accords. So the Basel I, Basel II, and Basel III. And basically what the Basel Accords did, is they put different countries on equal footing when it comes to how much capital their bank should have. So for example, let's say that I'm an importer of foreign goods located in Murray, Kentucky. And I deal with a bank here in Murray. And the people that I import from, let's say they're from another country, and so I've got to deal some with their banks in terms of receiving payments or them receiving payments from me. Well, there's some risk there. Because what if the bank in the other country is not financially stable, it has very, very little capital, and before they can make a payment to me, that bank shuts down. And I'm stuck losing, who knows, I might be importing $1 million worth of stuff at a time. So I'm stuck losing $1 million because that bank's capital in another country wasn't up to par with United States bank capital standards. So that's what these three did, is they simply said in certain countries, those banks are expected to have the same capital requirements as United States banks. And I'm not going to get into all of this here because believe me, it gets really tedious in terms of what's happening here. We're in the middle of implementing this one now, Basel III, but that might be changed based on the new presidential administration, the rollback of some financial regulations. For example, the Dodd-Frank, if we roll it back or roll a lot of it back, then you may see some changes here. So again, there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to capital. And you've got a link down here that if you really are bored sometime, you can take a look at this link at the bottom of the page and read more about bank capital. But the way this works is this risk-weighted assets and risk-based capital, it simply separates assets and off-balance sheet obligations into categories based on how risky they are. And each category is assigned a risk weight. If I can find my mouse. Okay. So, this is, in general, how these assets are weighted. Okay? For example, in the 0% risk category is cash. So this kind of maybe makes this a little more understandable. If a bank has cash in the vault, there is no risk of losing money on that cash. So they have to assign zero capital against the risk of a loss for that cash. Does that make sense? Deposits at the Federal Reserve. If a bank has deposits at the Fed, there is zero loss of them losing that money. 0% loss of them losing that money. So they don't have to hold any capital against deposits at the Fed. Also, claims on governments or securities guaranteed by the government. There is 0% chance that they're going to lose money. So they don't have to have any capital set aside for these categories. So we go from the 0% category to the 20% category. These are going to be things like cash items in process of collection, claims on other banks, primarily Fed funds, national government agency securities, so government bonds, government agency bonds, and municipal bonds. These are pretty safe, okay? But they're riskier than cash. So what happens is, as you'll see in a minute, we're assigning a 20% risk weighting to those. So if we take the amount of these multiplied by 20%, that's going to give us or help us to calculate our risk-weighted assets. Because again, this is pretty simple math here. Let's say, for example, you're looking at your capital ratio. And we said earlier, you can calculate capital based on total assets. So I'll just say, for example, you've got $1 million in equity or capital, and you have $20 million of total assets. So your capital ratio in this case is 5%. But now this is total assets. This is saying that all assets are equally risky, which we know they're not. So if we look at risk-weighted assets, we might still have $1 million in capital, but our risk-weighted assets, let's say we're a conservative bank, so we have a lot of money invested in government agency bonds or municipal bonds or cash. And so we have, when we're multiplying these assets, these different asset classes, by these low risk weightings, what it does is it takes our risk-weighted assets down to possibly $10 million. So it's showing us this is how much in terms of risk-weighted assets we have. And so in this case, our capital ratio is now 10%, which in this case, we would be undercapitalized, but because we're measuring it against risk-weighted assets and not total assets like we did here, we are fully funded in terms of capital. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to make this denominator smaller through the risk weightings. Does that make sense? Kind of how that works, how that operates? Some people are shaking their head, yes, just because you think that's what I want you to do. All right, well, let's take a look at some of the other risk weightings real quick. Okay, the 50% category. Revenue bonds issued by area and local governments. Who can explain to me we talk about general obligation bonds here of municipalities. This is talking about a revenue bond of a municipality. what's the difference between a general obligation bond and a revenue bond? It is more risky, and so I'll finish that with another question. Why is it more risky? Why is a revenue bond more risky than a general obligation bond? If I'm investing as a bank, if I'm investing in those bonds. Okay, I'm glad you'll let me explain. So, a revenue bond is a bond whose interest payments and par value, principal payments, are connected to some specific source of revenue created by the bond issue. Probably the simplest example of this would be a toll bridge. Okay, so let's say you spend $50 million to build a bridge over a river, but it opens up occasionally to let ships through. And if you want to go over that bridge, okay, you have to pay a toll to go over that bridge. Let's say it's $5 per car. Now, you don't have to go over the bridge. You could take a longer way around, take another 2 hours of driving, and you wouldn't have to use the bridge. But every time a car pays $5, the revenue from that toll, thus the name revenue bond, helps make the interest payments and the par value payment on those bonds that were issued to build the bridge in the first place. So does that make sense, kind of how that works? A general obligation bond, it is just a bond that is dependent on tax revenue to make the interest payments. So taxes come in at a little steadier rate than, say, a revenue source against a toll bridge or whatever else it might be. Okay, so that's why these are considered just a little bit riskier. Also, 1 to 4 family residential mortgage loans. This is a fancy way of saying a home loan. So when you borrow money to buy a house, they're going to take a mortgage, or you're going to take out a mortgage. They're going to place a lien against your house, and we'll talk about this later in the semester. These are rated at the 50% category. They're pretty safe because when it comes to making your house payment, most people want to make their house payment. I mean, you can let the credit card bills go, you can let the car payment go, but you really like sleeping with a roof over your head each night. So most people try to make their house payment. And then privately issued mortgage-backed securities. And we're going to talk more about mortgage-backed securities again later in the semester. Then we've got 100% category rating. So any loan not included in the categories that we just looked at, and also fixed assets. So we have to keep a lot of capital on hand for these. And actually, because of some of the problems with the financial crisis dating back about 10 years, regulators actually stepped in and said, banks, you have some assets that we want you to hold more than 100% in terms of capital against the risk, against the asset value. And so we can go to the over 100% category. So these are going to be things like Category 2 mortgage loans, some commercial loans. If you've got a past due loan, that's a risky asset. So you have to hold more capital against that than you would other types of loans. And then any kind of securitization exposures or equity exposures. So again, I don't want you to get too caught up in all of this in terms of memorizing the risk weightings and all of that, okay? But just I want you to understand that when we're talking about capital and we talk about the risk-weighted capital, which you'll actually be calculating that, I believe, this is what it's referring to, is how risky is the bank. Because, again, it just makes sense. Some banks are really risky. They like kind of pushing the envelope. Some other banks are very conservative. And if you're a conservative bank, it is unfair to you to have to set aside and have to hold as much capital as the riskier bank. It's just like your car insurance. If you're a safe driver, should you have to pay as much in terms of insurance as somebody who's had 7 speeding tickets in the last 6 months and 3 accidents? Would you say that's fair? Some of you are smiling like, yeah, I've had a few speeding tickets in the last few months. But no, so that's the same thing. It's a risk-based scenario. That's what we're talking about here. Okay, so when it comes to ratios, now again, as you kind of become comfortable with these and some of the terminology, because some of this is going to be brand new to you, then it's going to get a lot easier, because typically you're not actually calculating the ratios. You're just looking at the ratios that have already been calculated. But we go through this just like we do in Finance 330, because I want you to understand when you see something like the loan to deposit ratio, I want you to understand, if you just see the number, I want you to understand what goes into that, or the return on equity, or the net non-interest margin, or whatever it might be. So what I want you to do for the next few minutes is take out your income statement, your balance sheet, and your statement of ratios. You can work together on this. You can ask me for help. You can help each other out. But I want you to take a few minutes. We're going to be calculating December 31st, 2016 numbers. And I want you to calculate for me the ratios on the front and back of that page. If you get stuck, that's fine. Stop. You raise your hand. I'll be happy to come by and help you out. But once we work on them, then we'll go over them. 2 classes ago, I think. But if you need some more, I've got some up here. And if anyone needs a calculator, I've got some calculators up here. Multiple choice. 40. You've got, I think, about an hour and a half to take the test. You should be, that should be plenty of time to take the test. An hour and a half. Yes, 2016.
How many December?
If you set your calculator, that's good, to 4 and just round to 2 decimal places. And so set it to 4 and round to 2 decimal places. Okay. Yeah, so you will start using these formulas, and you'll just start writing it in and calculating it. Okay? Okay, so you've got your formula sheet here, and what you're going to do is you can see the name of the formula. So I've got the different categories: profitability, loan quality, liquidity, capital, and overhead. You've got anywhere between 3 and 6 ratios for each category. You'll see the name of the formula. For example, the first one's return on assets. It's equal to net income divided by total assets of the bank. So you would find that. You find net income on the income statement. You'd find total assets on the balance sheet. If you would round to 2 decimal places on your ratios, but just jump in and start. Okay, there's no easy way to do this, so you just got to kind of plow through it. for, okay, so operating revenues are going to be equal to interest income plus non-interest income. So it's going to be interest income plus non-interest income. And then operating expenses are going to be interest expense and non-interest expense. Okay. Now, we've come up with our first question, and several of you are going to have this one. If you take a look at the third ratio down, net operating margin, it asks for operating revenues and operating expenses. The operating revenues of a bank come from two sources. And we talked about this last week. That is going to be interest income plus non-interest income. The operating revenues of a bank. In other words, how does the bank make money? They make money from two sources, interest income and non-interest income. The operating expenses of a bank, which it asks for next, these also come from only two sources, interest expense and non-interest expense. And you'll find you'll line item for each of those. So you just have to do the math, add them together, and then divide by total assets. Now, what you may want to do for the test is you may want to print out, I guess it kind of depends, well, you'll be writing on this. You may want to print out a clean copy of your ratio sheet that you've got, the blank one. And so print out a clean copy. You might want to write in, for example, operating revenues equal interest expense or interest income plus non-interest income, and operating expenses, interest expense plus non-interest expense. But you may want to just use that as your formula sheet and then just add in any other formulas that we might have talked about. But that's a lot easier than going back and writing all of it out. Okay, now here's a couple of ratios here. On the fourth one down, net interest spread, it asks what is net interest income. So we had this, we talked about this last week. It's in the red here. Net interest income is interest income minus interest expense. That's what the bank earns on its interest-related products minus what it pays. And then on the next slide, you've got net non-interest income, which is non-interest income minus non-interest expense. And we said this is typically going to be a negative number because the major part of non-interest expense are the salaries and benefits that you pay your employees. So it's going to be pretty expensive. It's going to be a negative number for net non-interest income. It's going to be operating revenue is going to be interest income, this number, plus non-interest income, this number. So the 26,495 plus the 69,14. That's exactly right. Earning assets. Earning assets are going to be anything that earns the bank interest. Okay, so I think you could go through and add them up, but I think I've simplified it some back here.
Oh, hey, look at that.
And I'll just go ahead and put that line item there.
Thank you.
Now remember, on the back of the balance sheet, there's some memo items. So things like risk-weighted assets, earning assets, number of full-time employees, non-current assets, loan 90 days or more past due, things that you're going to need for some of these calculations. So typically, if you were doing this, you have access to all the bank's information. Well, I had to kind of take a shortcut here and just provide you with some of the information that you might not have found on a traditional income statement or balance sheet. Okay, somebody asked about earning assets earlier. We said earning assets are anything that earns the bank interest. So you could go through and add those up, or I've just gone ahead and put a line item on the back of the balance sheet that says total earning assets, which is $450,214. No. Net, the word net means you're going to subtract one from the other. So net non-interest income is going to be non-interest income minus non-interest expense. Did you see your Canvas score?
Yeah,
It's good. Yep. Yeah, unless it says, because again, the wording is really important here. So if it says, net interest income, then that's a whole different category, but that's just interest income. You look like you had a question. For which one? Operating revenue. Operating revenue is going to be how the bank makes money. So it's going to be interest income plus non-interest income. So it's going to be this number plus this number, the 6914. Be the 26,495 plus the 6914. And then the other one, which is the operating expenses, is going to be interest expense plus non-interest expense. So that's going to be that plus this.
Net non-interest income is net interest income minus non-interest expense.
Net interest income is going to be non-interest income minus non-interest expense. Yeah.
So non-interest income.
Non-interest income. So that the word net tells you you're subtracting one from the other. And net interest income, interest income minus interest expense. It is. It's going to be everything, but I just went ahead on the back and added it up for you. But it should be, if you took your net loans and leases plus your total investments and then anything else that makes the bank interest income, it should equal that. Because earning assets are simply anything that makes the bank interest income. What? Typically, these down to set your calculator to 4 decimal places. You shouldn't have. That should be enough, and you can round to 2. A lot of them are going to come out like, 0.092, which would be 9.82% if you write it out. Is that what you were asking? Yeah. So if you take it out to 4 decimals, like for example, if it was 0.0472 or whatever, that would equal 4.72%. What, do net now?
For net non-interest margin,
Mm-hmm.
is it usually negative?
It is. It's going to be negative, and the reason is because your non-interest expense is going to have your salaries, your employee salaries in it. That's going to cause that number to be huge, and so it's going to be a negative number. Interest-bearing liabilities are going to be, let's see, where's my balance sheet? That's typically it's going to be technically correct, what you might do, for example, when you're looking at this. For example, a lot of banks would have their checking accounts or demand deposits broke out into interest-paying checking versus not. Some checking accounts don't pay interest. So you would subtract the ones that don't pay interest out. You would subtract those balances. But since we don't know that, we can just use total liability. Okay.
On the net non-interest, is it just that?
It's going to be.
Net interest income and then non-interest, but I don't see it.
It's going to be.
No.
The net simply means you're subtracting from the other. It's going to be non-interest income minus non-interest expense. It's going to end up being a negative number. Okay, so your ratio is going to be a negative ratio. Interest-bearing liabilities are going to be, now, if we go over here, under liabilities, that's going to be anything that costs the bank interest expense. So anything, any deposit accounts they have to pay interest on. Now, if you take a look at this, for example, it has demand deposits, which are checking accounts. Some checking accounts don't pay interest. So if we knew that, we could subtract that out, but we don't know that. So what we're going to assume is all of these liabilities, total liabilities, all of this, the bank is paying interest on all of those. So you're just going to use the total liabilities number. Now, this is going to be interest income minus interest expense. Yeah, you got it backwards. And then this is going to be non-interest income minus non-interest expense. So when you see the word net there, that tells you you have to subtract one from the other. Okay?
And then the other question, the interest-bearing liability,
I'm going to answer your question to everybody because several people have had that. So let me bring this up. Okay, let me bring up. Let's see, where is it? Okay, the cost of funding earning assets which is equal to interest expense divided by interest-bearing liabilities. Let's talk to all of you because several of you had this question. Now, think about what this says, interest-bearing liabilities. What that means is that is any liability that the bank pays interest on. So, deposit accounts, any other borrowing. Now, if we take a look at the balance sheet, and if you go to the back page of the balance sheet, well, this one actually, mine actually kind of starts here, but it's on your back page. You'll see liabilities. So you've got demand deposits, now accounts, core deposits, and you've got other deposits, and then you've got total liabilities. If this were an actual bank, some of these, for example, these checking accounts here, these demand deposits, some of these, of this $25,725, probably don't pay interest. So we could subtract that out because we're not paying interest on those accounts. The problem is we don't know with this bank how much is interest-bearing checking, how much is non-interest-bearing checking. So to make things simple, we're going to assume that the bank pays interest on all of these liabilities, all of their deposits, plus all of these federal home loan borrowings, bankers' acceptances. So we're going to use this number for interest-bearing liabilities, okay? Just total liabilities. That makes our life just a little bit easier. No. These, they'll be down here. 149.
Is the provision for land lease losses?
The provision is going to be found on the income statement. The allowance is the total amount that you set aside is found on the balance sheet. So the provision is how much you're setting aside each year that goes into the balance sheet total. Did you find it? Okay. Okay, so this, now when you see the word net, that means you're subtracting one from the other. So this is going to be interest income minus interest expense. And then this is going to be non-interest income minus non-interest expense, which is what you have there.
This would be
Net loans and leases are going to be, no, they're going to be over here on the balance sheet. Okay. So that's going to be your total loans and leases minus your allowance, which you set aside for bad loans, gives you your net amount of loans and leases. You have any questions? No?
Is the net loan charge-offs maybe the lowest number?
Those two are making me nervous. They haven't asked a question yet. Makes me nervous when people don't ask questions. Oh, okay. Well, that's okay.
current liability.
That's exactly right. Yeah, because, and the reason is some of these, for example, these are checking accounts, and some checking accounts don't pay interest, but we don't know how much of this $25,725 we're not paying interest on versus how much we are. So we're just assuming all of these liabilities, we're paying interest as a bank to our customers on all of these.
So we use the total liability?
Yes.
Okay.
So this would be considered the new capital, this is the old capital.
Yeah, that's all you're going to do. Go take the new minus the old, so that minus that divided by that. Which one? For this one? Provision for loan losses. So your provision, that's what's found on the income statement. That's how much you set aside each year for bad loans. The allowance is what's found on the balance sheet. So the provision, which is here, this amount, when you set it aside, goes into this line item here. Okay?
So you have subtracted two?
Do what?
You have subtracted two?
No, no. It's just that much will go into there. That much for this year went into this 5,764
So this is the amount you use?
for the provision. Yes. Now, when you get to the allowance, which is here, then you're going to use on the balance sheet the total amount that you set aside for bad loans, which is that amount.
So, got it got it where I've got my own sign anymore. Divided by, we got the ALLL, it is the allowance for loan lease losses, it's right there.
Plus stockholders' equity. That's going to be on the balance sheet on the back page. It'll be total.
So,
No. It is, let's see. No, it is. Yeah, that's supposed to have that your denominator. Yeah,
If you don't do the parentheses, it gives you some crazy number.
yeah. Yeah. And so that's going to be, that's how, see what, this is saying how many possible loans do you have going bad? So your non-current loans, what you foreclosed on, any days, loans 9 days or more past due, divided by how much cushion do you have to absorb those losses. So that's going to be your capital, which is your equity, plus your allowance for loan release loss, which is money you've set aside. So that tells you how much, and that actually comes from the S&L crisis in Texas, where you had lots of savings and loans shutting down. That's where that ratio comes from. So when it comes to that ratio, would you want that number to be as high as possible or as low as possible? The ratio itself. Yeah, so you want your numerator. as low as possible. That's exactly right. Okay, let me talk to you about another ratio just a minute that a couple of you have had questions about. It's going to be at the top of the second page, so if you turn your ratios over to the back page, it's called the Texas ratio. Some people look at that and they go, the Texas ratio, how does it get its name? Well, actually, this ratio comes from when we had the savings and loan crisis back in Texas and Louisiana back in the 1980s, and you had lots and lots of savings and loans fail because it was something similar to 2008 where you had you had home prices being overinflated because the oil industry was doing so well in Texas and Louisiana. So then when it crashed down, just like in 2008, you had lots of savings and loans fail. So if you think what happened in 2008 is not going to happen again, you're kidding yourself. But what this tells us is, take a look at what goes into this. Now, somebody pointed out to me, to be technically correct, if you're using a graphing calculator and putting everything in, there should be a parentheses around equity plus allowance for loan loss. Okay? So this is your numerator, non-current assets plus OREO, which is foreclosed assets, plus loans 90 days past due, divided by equity plus the allowance. So what this tells us is the numerator, these are loans that can possibly go bad at any time. This is money we can lose on our loans that we've made. The denominator, equity, this is capital, plus the allowance for loan and lease loss, this is money that we have set aside as a cushion for those bad loans. So as you're looking at this for a bank, would you want this number for your bank, the ratio, to be as large or as small as possible? I heard somebody say it. Small. You want that ratio to be as small as possible. Because what you want is, you want very, very small numbers here on top. You don't want a lot of bad loans or possible bad loans. And you want plenty of capital, stockholders' equity, and allowance for loan and lease loss. But this is a really good measure. As you start seeing this number get larger, that's a bank that can be in serious trouble. Now, again, that's just one ratio, but this is a really good indicator of, are we having some problems? Go ahead.
What you said before, go in total.
Total liability, yeah. You finished? Wow. You're like a rocket. Oh, that's tomorrow? See, this is fantastic. Did you see the stuff I sent you on the write-up and all of that?
Thank you so much. That's really, really helpful.
I don't know if it already made a lot of...
I mean, it's the loan writer. And I'm like, I was expecting to have a little more time to prepare for this whole thing. So,
Yeah. You could probably do just type in loan write-up or something, and there's probably some examples. But it kind of goes in and tells you sort of how to structure it. And that was actually written by an OCC examiner who's a former student of mine who now works in the Tulsa, Oklahoma field office. And he kind of went through and made a lot of notes on this is what...
yeah, so we looked at it a little bit, kind of like reviewing everything. That's the part I'm most worried about, but that was really, really helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Find active on this.
It's going to be equity capital
Equity capital.
right there.
Okay, and what's this mean?
The allowance for loan loss, that's to be the other side right there. Do what? Two decimal points. It'll be multiple choice format, and there'll be enough difference between the answers that, you won't be that close. But this is just good practice doing it this way. You understand those? What I was talking about? There could be a little of each, but it'll be enough of a difference in the answers that you won't have any trouble distinguishing. For example, if they're, one's percentage form, all percentage form, if one's in decimal form, and there'll be enough difference between the two that if it's not going to be like 100th of, there'll be a significant difference between the answers.
That's what I was wondering, is like how far in deep.
Yeah, no, it won't be like if you come up with that, I won't have like .0207 and .0209,
Yeah, sure.
something like that.
Like for this one, our new ones you do take the capital growth, the current minus the
That's exactly right. So it's going to be, this is just a percentage change. So it's the new amount of capital, 2016, minus the old amount of capital, divided by the old amount of capital. Yeah, a couple of you have asked about this, and this is just something that's really good to know in general, and that's how to calculate a percentage change. So if you go to your capital ratios, we've got one for capital growth and one for total asset growth. For capital growth, it says the percentage growth from period to period, the new minus the old divided by the old. That works for any percentage change. So what you would have here is you would have 2016 capital, the newest amount, minus 2015 capital, divided by 2015's capital. It's just going to give you a percentage change, how much capital, what was the percentage change in capital for the year. And that's just, I typically tell you not to memorize formulas. That's just one you should commit to memory, because you can use that when you're grocery shopping, when you're whatever, just the percentage change of whatever it might be. Do what?
This is an operating revenue.
Okay, operating expense. Interest expense plus non-interest expense. That further operating expenses are going to be interest expense minus non-interest expense. Yeah, that's all together. There should be parentheses around that. So it's going to be stockholders' equity, which is your capital, plus the allowance for loan and lease loss.
Thank you.
Okay, what I'm passing around is the exact same handout that the ratios are on, except I've gone through and worked through all of the ratios. Okay? So as you're comparing your numbers of what you get, you can compare it to those. Also on Canvas, you'll notice if you go down to the very bottom of the page on Canvas, well, towards the bottom of the page, you're going to have miscellaneous items, articles, etc. This is the blank ratio page that you just used. So if you wanted to print that out, it's on Canvas. And then this is the one that I'm passing out now, bank performance indicators with solutions. You'll notice it's not been made public, but now you should be able to see it once I publish it. So now it will show up also. So just in case you lose any of these handouts, they're all there on Canvas. What? Now what I want to do, I'm going to go through, I'm going to pull this up and we're going to talk about these ratios really quickly because I want you to understand what they're telling you, and some are a little bit easier to understand than others. Come on, man. All right, that's good as it's going to get. Okay, so let's take a look at these. This is the solution page that you've got coming around. The first couple here under profitability ratios, ROA and ROE, net income divided by total assets. So this bank has a 2% ROA, which is typically pretty good, and return on equity of 21.13%. Again, typically really, really good. Net operating margin to total assets. Notice, now this is operating revenues minus operating expenses. Operating revenues, that's the way the bank makes money. So that's going to be interest income plus interest expense. Minus operating expenses. That's going to be interest expense plus non-interest expense. Okay? Divided by total assets. So this bank has a net operating margin of 2.5%. Now, the net interest spread is net interest income. When you see the word net, that's telling you one thing is being subtracted from something else. So in this case, for net interest income, that's going to be interest income minus interest expense. So how much more in interest income does the bank make than interest expense divided by total assets? So this bank has a net interest spread of 4.31%. So in other words, it's making 4.31 percentage points more on what it's earning in interest versus what it's paying in interest. So that's a really important number that banks want to keep a close eye on. Net interest margin is net interest income divided by earning assets. Notice the only difference here is this uses total assets, the net interest margin uses earning assets. And this is going to be 4.73%. So this is saying that if we take out the bank building, the computers, the parking lot, anything that's not earning the bank interest, we're making 4.73% more on an interest income as compared to interest expense. Again, this net interest margin is looked at really, really closely. Then you've got net non-interest margin. This is going to be net non-interest income, which is non-interest income minus non-interest expense. And the same thing, we're dividing it by earning assets. So you'll notice this is going to be a negative number. And somebody remind me, why is it a negative number? What? That's exactly right. In interest expense, employee salaries and benefits typically are the largest source of non-interest expense. And it's going to make this non-interest expense larger than your non-interest income. Now, if you're super bank and you can turn this around and make it positive, that's fantastic. The problem is most banks can't, okay? So this is negative. Yield on earning assets. Interest income divided by earning assets, so you're making an average of 5.88% on all of the assets that are paying interest. The cost of funding these assets. So this is what you're making when you loan money out or invest it in different bonds. This is what you're paying to get the deposits to loan out or invest. So you can see this bank's probably in pretty good shape right now. I mean, it's making almost 6%. With interest rates at historical lows, it's paying a little over 1%. That's not going to last forever, although it's lasted a long time. So these are the profitability ratios. Loan quality or asset quality. So this is going to tell us what type of loans is this bank making in terms of, are they paying like they're supposed to? Do we have a lot of past due loans? Again, this is a really serious category because if you're making a lot of bad loans, it's going to eat through, if you have a lot of charge-offs, it's going to eat through your allowance for loan and lease loss, then it's going to eat through your profitability, and then it's going to start eating into your capital. And when it starts cutting down your capital, like we talked about here, is this numerator gets smaller and smaller and smaller, eventually your ratio is going to be so small that examiners are going to show up on a Friday afternoon at about 5 o'clock at your bank, knocking on the door, and they're going to come in and they're going to shut your bank down. Somebody else is going to take it over, and it's going to open up Monday under a different name. But your customers probably won't know the difference, but that's typically what happens when a bank fails. So, loan loss provision to charge-offs. Now remember, the provision, this is on the income statement. This is how much you're setting aside each year. Charge-offs, that's, as the name implies, that's loans you've charged off your books. They're not paying, so you're charging them off. You're not going to be able to keep accruing interest income on those loans. So we've got 1845 divided by 1,000, 184.5%. Charge-offs to total loans and leases. So less than 1%, 0.3 of 1%. Allowance to total loans and leases. Remember, the allowance, this is how much on your balance sheet you've set aside total for bad loans. And so in this case, we've set aside 1.74% of our total loans and leases, which is probably okay for most banks. And then the delinquent loans to asset ratio. Delinquent loans are loans that aren't paying as agreed. So that's going to be your non-current assets plus your other real estate owned, divided by total assets. So you have 0.65 of 1% in delinquent loans. When you start having trouble, when we start heading into a recession, that's where you start seeing some of these ratios start increasing. People aren't making their car payments, they're not making their boat payments, they're not making their house payments. You're having to repossess some items, you're having to foreclose on some houses. That's when you're going to start seeing these numbers start to increase. And if you're doing a time series, you can watch it. You can watch it increase. And you can kind of try to stay ahead of it a little bit, because if you're looking at all of this in terms of way after the fact, 2 years late, even a year late sometimes that's not going to do you any good. But if you're watching it on a weekly basis or a quarterly basis or a semi-annual basis, a lot of times you can jump ahead of it. Now, the Texas ratio, I said this is basically taking any loan that could go bad, non-current, OREO, loans 90 days or more past due, divided by the cushion that's set aside for potential bad loans. That's going to be your allowance for loan and lease loss and your stockholders' equity, your capital. So this one's got, it's at 6.8%. What you really want is this number to be as small as possible, because you want the numerator, these numbers, you want those almost non-existent. And you want this, I mean, you don't want to have too much capital on hand because your capital is not making you any money, and you don't want your too large of an allowance on hand because it's not making you any interest income, but you want to have an adequate amount here. Liquidity, loan to deposit, loan to core deposits, and loan to assets. Your loan to deposit ratio is 84.77%. That's a pretty good ratio. You're going to see this number if you're in an area with high loan demand. For example, if you're in Franklin, Tennessee, Brentwood, Tennessee, anywhere south of Nashville, going down the I-65 corridor, a lot of loan demand, you're probably going to see banks operating there with really high loan-to-deposit ratios. The reason is there's a lot of loan demand. And so they're loaning out almost all of their deposits. As a matter of fact, sometimes you see this ratio over 1.0 or over 100%. So it's saying the bank is loaning out more than 100% of its deposits. Now, how in the world can a bank do that? What other sources of funds does a bank have? And we talked about this last week. Fed funds, okay? Fed funds, overnight loans between banks. So we said if a bank has a lot of loan demand, some banks don't have very much loan demand, they'll loan the bank with a lot of loan demand money. Well, that's how you get to over 100% for this ratio, okay? But again, you can, when it comes to loans and when it comes to growing, you can, as a bank, you can grow too fast. So that's why, as we jump down here to these capital ratios, these are what kind of keep a bank in control and not growing too fast. Because if you outgrow your capital, you're in trouble. Now, these other two, loan to core deposits, remember we said core deposits, those are the deposits that are going to be there. Those are the customers that are going to stick with you. So having a lot of core deposits, that's a good thing for a bank. And then the loan to assets ratio, 65.73%. Okay, capital ratios. This bank has just a basic capital ratio of 9.79%, equity capital divided by total assets. This is the capital growth and total asset growth. This is where I said, if you're growing too fast, a lot of times people think, you know, if you're a business, you want to grow as fast as possible. Well, there's a problem, because you'll notice your capital here is a combination typically, now I've kind of simplified it here on your balance sheet, but typically it's going to be your stockholders' equity plus retained earnings. So as a bank is profitable, it sets aside some of those retained earnings, it can increase its capital. The problem here is if you grow too fast, and as we talked about over here, with the amount of capital you have, if your assets are outgrowing your capital growth, so in this case, assets are growing at 1.3%, capital is growing at 17.2%. There's no problem here. But if this were reversed, you might want to be worried. Because what will happen is your capital ratio, your assets are growing so fast, your capital ratio keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller until the regulators simply come in and say, look, you've got to raise an extra $10 million in capital in the next 180 days, 6 months. And if you don't, we're going to have to come up with some kind of plan for you to start shrinking your bank back down. So what you have to do is you have to call your investors who've already put money in your bank, bought stock, and say, by the way, we've been growing pretty fast. They're making a lot of loans. I'm not sure they're really good loans, but we would like for you to kick in an extra $500,000 each. Now, if they have any indication that their original investment may be going bad, do you think they're going to give you more money? No. Okay? So growing too fast is not always good for a bank. And then you've got the risk-based capital. This is what we talked about earlier tonight. So notice total assets, equity capital divided by total assets, 9.79%, equity capital divided by the risk-weighted assets, because this bank does have assets that are less than 100% risk-weighted, 12.04%. So this bank would be considered well-capitalized, looking at the capital standards set by bank examiners. And then you've got overhead ratios. One is what's called the efficiency ratio. It's operating expenses divided by operating revenue. Now, this is kind of an odd ratio because this is one you have to know how it's calculated. Some people will calculate it like this, and the way it's set up, would you want this ratio to be as high or as low as possible? High or low as possible. You want your numerator, you want that low. You want that number large. So a small number divided by a large number gives you a small number. So in this case, you would want it as small as possible. Now, some banks do the exact opposite. They calculate it as operating revenue divided by operating expenses. And in that case, you would want it as high as possible. So again, it's one thing that when I would go into a bank and take a look at it, it's one of the first questions we would ask is, they typically have this calculated, how do you calculate internally your efficiency ratio? Because you could spend a lot of time investigating why this ratio is so low or so high, depending on how you calculate it, to find out you've been doing it the exact wrong way compared to what the bank's been looking at. Assets per employee. This bank has 149 full-time employees, has assets of $494,320. So this bank has $3,317,650 in assets per employee. Now, historically, for a long time, if a bank had one employee per $1 million of assets, that's pretty good. Then technology kicked in, and you started having one employee for $2 million of assets. Now, this bank has one employee for over $3 million of assets. So you would want this number to be as large as possible up to the point where you're still providing good customer service. You could put me in charge of this bank, and I could make this number $10 million by laying off 2/3 of my workforce. The problem is my customers aren't going to be very happy because I'm not going to have enough people to service all the customers coming through the drive-through, the teller windows, phone calls, whatever. Asset utilization ratio, revenues divided by assets, 6.76%, and employee productivity ratio. Basically what this is saying is how much pre-tax operating income are we creating per full-time employee? And we're creating $70,440 per employee. And of course, you would want that number to be as high as possible also, to a certain extent. All right, so are there any questions about these ratios? Everybody see where the numbers are coming from? If you're given an income statement or a balance sheet, you know what an asset is, what a liability is, interest income versus non-interest income. You're feeling pretty good about it? Okay. Now, the rest of this, I'm going to leave up to your... Now, this is talking about, and we'll look at this at another time. There's something called the UBPR. What I want you to know about this, or what you need to know for the test, I'll go ahead and tell you, is you need to know what the letters UBPR stand for. Pretty simple. It stands for Uniform Bank Performance Report. And this is a report put out by the FFIEC, which you can see that stands for the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council. This is the one that says about 40 pages long, numbers all over the place. It's a really good way to examine a bank, but unless you're comfortable with ratios, it's really overwhelming. But once now that we've gone through some of the ratios, it would make more sense to you. But I'll pull one of these up another time. I'll just jump on the FFIEC website. As a matter of fact, if any of you are interested, which I'm sure you're not going to worry about this week, but it shows you what comparisons you can make, and then it shows you how to obtain a UBPR. I mean, step by step. Click this button, click that button, and then how to print it, which is here. Now, this is pretty important here, so I put it in red. Before you actually print it, be sure to select landscape. Otherwise, you're going to print out about 45 pages, 48 pages. And then you're going to see it doesn't all fit, so you're going to have to go back and print it again in landscape format. So change it from portrait to landscape before you waste a lot of paper. All right. And then like I said, we'll look at this sample UBPR later. And then this walks you through on each page, what does each page cover. Now, it just shows here through page 14A, okay? But keep in mind, some of these pages are multiple. So you may have, for example, page 10, you may have 6 or 7 page 10s. So that comes out to the 37 to 40 pages, depending on what bank you're analyzing. Now, this is one thing that when we look at it, we'll look at a UBPR, it'll make more sense, but this is actually a pretty neat little comparison. What this does is, when you look at a Uniform Bank Performance Report, it's going to have your bank's income information. For example, this bank had interest income of 4.71% of total assets. The peer group that this bank is in had a 3.97% interest income to total assets. You'll notice this bank is lower than this. But a lot of times we look at this and we just say, okay, 4.71% versus 3.97%. What's the difference? What does it matter? Well, if we could convert this to dollars, it means more to us. So what I've done here is I've taken the average total assets for this bank, which is $681 million. I've just cut the 3 zeros off the end. And if we know this, then we can calculate. Now, it's not precise, okay? Because, again, the peer group is rather large. So the average bank size in the peer group is not going to be the average asset size of our bank, but it could be close. But the difference between these two numbers in terms of dollars means your bank is making $5 million more than the average bank in your peer group in terms of just interest income. So we're taking that percentage that doesn't mean much to us, and we're turning it into $5 million, which does mean a lot to us. And then we can do the same thing for interest expense. You'll notice this bank has a lot higher interest expense than the peer. So it's costing us over $2.5 million more. And then we just kind of follow this down. So when you get down to net operating income, you can see that our bank at 1.5% versus 1.31 is making about almost $1.3 million more than the average bank in our peer group. And for a lot of bankers, this means a lot to them because they look at the percentages, it doesn't tell them much. This actually means something. And then finally, the last few slides here, you can read these just as easily as I can talk about them. It just talks about the different types of risk, or some of the major types of risk faced by banks, and you have the definition of each one. So just be sure to look over these types of risks. So credit risk, the risk that an investment is not going to pay back. So it could be a loan or a bond. Liquidity risk, market risk, interest rate risk, operational risk, legal and compliance risk, and reputation risk. Oh, and capital risk. All right, so that is all of chapter 5 and 6. You've got the practice problems from chapter 5 at the end of the chapter, chapter 6 practice problems, which I talked about those last week also. And what I want to do now really quickly is take a look at the Test 1 study guide, which is here on Canvas. All right, so see if I can fit all this on here. Okay, so for chapter 1, again, you can just kind of go through the slides in the textbook, and you can kind of see where this is going when it comes to the study guide. The definition of a commercial bank. We said it has to make business loans, and it has to provide checking accounts. That's the definition. And then what are some of the other types of banks? And those are found in some of the tables that are listed. What's a non-financial based entity that are competitors of banks and examples? I don't know if we actually talked about this much or not, but these are things like GMAC financing, Ford Credit. They're called non-financial based entities. So they do some of the things that a bank does. For example, GMAC will make you a car loan, but they're not necessarily a bank. Money creation process. So this is when a bank makes a loan. We talked about the money multiplier. If you're given a loan amount, an amount of required reserves, you need to be able to calculate how much in new money will that create. The various roles of a modern bank, the key trends reshaping banking today. This actually goes with here. I know how banks create money and how to calculate it, so that goes back here. And then homework problems for chapter 1, numbers 3, 4, and 5. Chapter 2, these are some of the banking laws that we talked about. Actually, I had you read through a lot of this yourself. I can tell you, for example, you probably need to know this one pretty well. That's just a suggestion, but I would know that one. You probably want to know this one pretty well. I can't really give you much stronger of a hint than that. And so I'm not saying don't look at any of the others. I'm just saying those are two major ones. Know what a charter of incorporation is and which regulatory agency issues them. So basically that's pretty simple. If you want to open up a new bank, you've got to have a charter of incorporation. They're either issued by the state where the bank's opening or by the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency if it's a nationally chartered bank. That's it, state or the OCC. Know what types of banks or holding companies each regulator is in charge of. We had a nice little slide on that. They kind of summarize, who does the OCC supervise, who does the FDIC supervise, etc. And then homework problems and projects 1 and 2. Chapter 3, know in general which banks hold the most, the least assets. which size banks are most numerous versus the fewest. Know the various organization types of banks. So what is a unit bank? What is a branch bank? What is a bank holding company? And the advantages and disadvantages of each. Know the types of non-bank related businesses bank holding companies can own. So it has to be finance related. So bank holding companies can own mortgage companies, insurance companies, check processing centers, but it has to be finance related. For example, a finance or a bank holding company can't own a auto repair shop. Okay, it simply doesn't fit under the umbrella. Know the structure and organization of banks now I'm going to change this just a little bit, okay? This says know the structure and organization of banks in Europe, which country has the most banks. I'm going to change it to just know the difference in the makeup between the United States banking system and the rest of the world. And what I said was the United States tends to have a lot more banks, but they're much smaller. Other countries tend to have very few banks, but they're very large. So if you know that, you're good on that question. And then homework problems 1 and 2. And then chapter 5, that's in 6, that kind of we went over that together. So know in general the makeup of a bank's balance sheet and income statement, including each line item, what they mean. Definition of a non-performing loan, that's a loan that's past due 90 days or more. Know how the provision for loan loss expenses and the allowance for loan and lease loss is calculated. There will be in your book, and I think in the slides, it talks about the allowance for loan and lease loss. So it'll start out with how much do you have at the beginning of the year, what comes into it, what goes out of it, and what do you have at the end of the year. Okay, so take a close look at that. Know how the provision, know the banker's acceptance definition, so know what a banker's acceptance is. You can just Google that if you need to, but it should be in your book. And homework problems and projects listed here. And then finally, for chapter 6, the types of bank risk, the bank performance ratios, what they mean, how to calculate them, etc. And finally, homework problems number 4 and 5. Now, you're going to look at this, and I've talked about this, and I go through this, and possibly, at least I hope, as I'm talking about this, make it seem pretty simple. Keep in mind, there's a lot of material here, okay? This is information that you're not used to looking at. So if you're wavering on should I study much or should I not study very much, I can pretty much tell you you're probably not going to overstudy for this test. It's not that it's an exceptionally hard test, it's a lot of material that you're not used to. So you want to err on the side of caution when it comes to preparing for this. You've got a week to prepare for it. Now, the test itself will be 40 multiple choice questions. There were 2.5 points each. The calculations will be in multiple choice format. The definitions and theory, multiple choice format. You will have your own formula sheet. And again, if you would like me to take a look at it beforehand, I'll be happy to look at it and make sure it's okay. But other than that, and that's all we're going to do next week is just take the test and go home. Okay? So, any questions or anything before I let you go tonight? All right, I'm going to be out of town for the rest of the week at actually a banking conference. So I'll be back Monday. So if you have questions or anything, you can email them to me or you can stop by my office on Monday. Everybody have a great week. I will see you next Tuesday night. And if anybody wants to attend the banquet, here's the invitations, and you need to sign your name to the list, please. Thank you.
I haven't gotten mine yet. I ordered it from some off the wall place and it got lost in the mail.